Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar panel discussion entitled The Science of Childhood Trauma and Family Separation, a discussion of short and long-term effects. I'm Laura Namey. I'm the Executive Director of SRCD, the Society for Research in Child Development. This webinar is an important part of SRCD's response to the recent U.S. immigration practices involving separating children from their parents among refugee and asylum-seeking families at the U.S.-Mexico border. As you know, these children have been apart from their families in many cases for weeks. And of course, even before the separation, they had already been experiencing conditions of stress and trauma that led their families to flee to the border in the first place. This child separation practice has been halted, and the process of reuniting children and their families has thankfully now begun, but many of these children are still separated from their loved ones, and the recovery process after reunification is going to be a difficult one. The science shows that there are lasting effects of these traumatic experiences for the children and their families. So our goal in organizing this expert panel discussion today is to share with you what developmental science tells us about what these families can expect moving forward and why. We're so pleased to have so many of you joining us for this discussion today. Just a few practicalities to share with you before we begin. All attendees, microphones, and webcams will be muted so that we can all clearly hear and see the panel discussion. Thanks to so many of you who submitted questions when you registered. Those have been incorporated into our discussion today. If another question occurs to you during the session, please feel free to type it into the chat box on the navigation panel that you see on your screen. We obviously won't be able to cover everyone's questions today, but we'll address as many as possible, time permitting. And if you're interested in getting more information about our presenters, full presenter bios, as well as the evidence brief that we have disseminated, are available for download in the handout section of your navigation panel. Also, please note that we are recording this session and we'll be posting it to SRCD's YouTube channel. We know some interested people are unable to attend, so please feel free to let others know that it will be available within 24 hours. We're also live tweeting the webinar at SRCD Tweets using the hashtag Science of Trauma. So now it is my honor to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Duncan Fischer from the Family Initiative in the United Kingdom. Duncan has worked on child and family policy for more than 20 years with a particular interest in father-child relationships, and has been appointed an officer of the Order of the British Empire for its important work promoting child welfare. He currently manages the popular Child and Family blog, which reports on the latest child development research in partnership with Princeton University in the US, Cambridge University in the UK, and the Jacobs Foundation in Switzerland. Duncan, thank you so much for joining us and serving as our moderator. I'll go ahead and turn the conversation over to you now.
Thank you very much, Laura. It's a real honor to moderate such an important discussion with such eminent experts at a really very important time. So what I would like to do first is introduce the three panelists quickly, and then give an overview of the next hour and what we'll discuss. So first is Dr. Nim Tottenham, who is Associate Professor of Psychology at Columbia University, and she is the Director of the Developmental Affective Neuroscience Laboratory. Her expertise is in brain development, underlying emotional behavior in humans, and her research has highlighted fundamental changes in brain circuitry across development, and the fundamental role and powerful role that early experiences have on the construction of brain circuits. Dr. Cynthia García Coll is Professor of Clinical Psychology at Albizu University in San Juan, Puerto Rico. She's the editor of SRCD's, that's our host today, flagship journal Child Development. Her research focuses on social, cultural, and biological influences on child development, particularly in at-risk and minority populations. And finally, Dr. Gabriela Livas-Stein is a licensed psychologist and associate professor of clinical psychology at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Dr. Stein studies the experiences of Latino young people, their response to discrimination, the role of cultural values on their development, their access to mental health services. and she is the Vice President of the Society of Research on Adolescence and an associate editor of its journal. So we have three fantastic experts to give us an insight. We'll divide the conversation, the presentation into three parts. So first, we will look at the impacts on children of separation from their parents, both short-term and long-term. Then we'll address some additional questions that you, the participants, have submitted when you registered for this. And we'll end the discussion with a more practical question, which is what can we and what should the public authorities do in the current situation? So to start, I'd like to start by asking Dr. García Coll about the immediate impacts on children of being forcibly and suddenly separated from their parents in an alien environment.
Thank you. Thank you for that good question, and thank you for the audience to be here. What we know from the research evidence on what are the immediate impacts of stress and parental separation on kids and family has a very long-term history in our field. The first studies were conducted during World War II, just after World War II, both in terms of parental loss and also in terms of orphanages. And one of the things that we know is, that stress and trauma are not single events. That stress and trauma are cumulative events. And so we need to put the context of this particular parental separation really clearly. Migrants come with a history, normally, from the research that we know about this. They come to our borders fleeing war. They come to our borders fleeing persecution, domestic violence, extreme poverty, and other sources of trauma and stress. So although they are following the American dream, as many other generations have, into our country, trauma is part of the life history of these parents and children and families. So we have to think about it. Nobody leaves the comfort of their home. They leave the home culture. They leave their family, their neighborhood, their schools, if things are working. These are families who have long history of trauma and toxic stress. And when trauma and toxic stress is high, we see that there is cost to the individuals and the family unit, not only emotionally, socially, educationally, and cognitively, but also in terms of their body. And, we have Nim is an expert that she will be talking about the brain in particularly. But what we're finding right now is that trauma and toxic stress has immediate effects on how we behave, how we feel, how we think, and how our stress responses are available. What we know basically is that the longer the stress is going on, the longer the separation is going on, the fact that children do not have their families and their parental figures to help them cope with what's going on, the more toxic stress the kids experience, and it activates the body stress management system. What does that mean? That means that trauma continues to have not only behavioral, emotional, and cognitive negative consequences, but it changes how the body reacts and responds to short-term and long-term stress. So our stress systems get activated. Sometimes it's much harder to get them down. Kids stay on fearing, in anxiety, in senses of stress, even long after the original source of the trauma and the stress is there. And I just want to emphasize that this is coming, what we have in this area of research is long-term traditions that have really already established how terrible it is for children and their families to go through this kind of separation, especially when they are, have been exposed to toxic stress. So that would be my initial reflections, and thank you for the question.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that. It is a key point to recognise that these families are already traumatised when they arrive before any of this happens.
Right.
So I understand that these very toxic and stressful situations, particularly over a long period, can actually affect a child's brain development. So Dr. Tottenham, would you describe what we know about these brain changes and how and why they occur?
Sure. Well, I'm really glad that Cynthia used the word trauma, because often when, we think about children in this type of situation, our immediate response is that it's so sad. But sad is not really the issue here that we're concerned about. It's really the trauma and the enduring consequences that trauma can have on behavior by acting on developing neurobiology. And so we often think about harm as things that we can see happening to children, but it's harder to see this type of harm because it's invisible in many ways. But with neuroscientific tools, we can actually see the changes that happen when children experience this type of trauma. So when you or I or children, for that matter, experience a major threat to our survival, all of us activate threat systems in our brains and in our bodies. So that includes activation of the amygdala, for example, a brain region that's really responsible for maintaining our immediate survival and making sure that we stay safe. We release stress hormones like cortisol, norepinephrine, all these kind of fight or flight responses. And that's a really adaptive thing to do when we think that we're in trouble. The challenge is that when we keep activating those circuits, when we keep activating those stress hormones, it becomes harder and harder to shut them off, particularly for children. Children aren't very good at regulating their emotions, and they're also not really good at regulating the neurobiology that gives rise to those big emotions. So as a species, we developed with the expectation that somebody else, a parent, is going to be available to help shut off those stress systems. So something that people often call parental buffering of these stress systems. So if we consider children who have experienced this plight of being in a really bad situation where the family needs to flee, making the trek to the United States, that's actually the population that needs immediate remediation. But instead, the worst thing in the world that could possibly happen, which is to be separated from your family when you're a child, has happened. So you've removed the major stress buffering system. And that's particularly dangerous during a period of rapid brain development in childhood. So the brain is undergoing a sensitive period where it's going to be so amenable to pressures from the environment. And if those pressures are toxic stress pressures, that's going to have a more enduring impact on brain development.
It's a very traumatic trauma. We're talking about trauma rather than sadness here, and it's absolutely. And your point about the parent being there as the protector when that parent is taken away in the middle of a trauma. Dr. Stein, in the evidence brief that you and your colleagues published recently, you talked not only about the short-term distress and fear and confusion that children experience, but also the longer-term effects, even after the kids are reunited with their parents. Can you talk a bit about these effects and how prevalent they are in this population?
Yeah, so thanks again for having me. The prevalence rates are hard to ascertain because there's not sort of wide range epidemiological data on this. But what we do know is that the long-term effects are psychological and health that have been found in terms of increased risk of depression, anxiety, PTSD, increased social difficulty with social functioning in adulthood, attachment in adulthood. So these effects and toxic stress have wide range of health effects as well. One thing I think is important to recognize is that this is a family unit. So as we've been talking a lot about the impact on these children, we also have to think about the impact of this traumatic separation on the parents and the family, and the disrupted attachment and the disrupted sort of those kinds of emotions and feelings that parents are having at having to sort of be separated from their kids, not knowing where their kids are. And so this leads to the point that even upon reunification, there's still continued risk that happens. What we know from the immigration literature in terms of reunification is that that process is also fraught with some difficulties, as there could be increases in parental guilt, and of child sort of confusion, misunderstanding, sometimes potentially even sort of thinking but blaming their parents or blaming themselves, right? So there's sort of this process that the family dynamic is going through, disrupting that sort of parenting context could also have these long-term effects. And I think an important point that Cynthia made earlier is that cumulative effects of trauma are going to be also important, right? That cumulative, that we know that those kids are then going to be at heightened risk in this separation and this additional stressor that they're experiencing. One thing we do know is that separation at immigration is typical. So this may not even be the first time that these families have been separated. And what we know from the literature is there's a wide range sort of these separations that might be happening. And then the deportation literature, some of the literature that has new literature that's coming out right now on kids and families that are being sort of impacted by raids and deportation, really show that the increase of both internalizing symptoms like depression and anxiety and acting out behaviors are still present post-reunification, even in the home countries where they've been deported to. So there's been interesting work done by Luis Valles and his colleagues that have followed these kids into those countries post-deportation and what happens, and the separations that happened around the deportation process. So I think it's just really important to recognize that this is sort of an impact at the family level, not just at the child individual level, and that disrupted family process just sort of further heightens the impact of this separation.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think any parent who's watched or heard the recordings, and if that was your own child, it's just unimaginable pain for the parents in that situation. Would any of the panelists like to add any points to that discussion of the impacts? We'll go on to discuss a few more particular questions.
I think, the point that Gabby makes that this is a family unit issue is so important, because when we think about a child, they're not just a small adult, they're actually part of a larger unit, which is their family. And so for a parent to be a really effective buffer of the child's stress, they themselves also need to be feeling safe as an individual. So this really is a family unit issue, both at the level of behavior and biology.
I mean, these are systems. No, we have to think about families as systems, and when any one particular member is affected or two particular members are affected, that's going to be adding to the whole system. So the parent that is not here has been left behind, or is waiting for them to come into the country, etc., is going to be affected as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much all for that. What we'll now do is just I'll ask you a few questions that have been sent in by the participants. So Dr. Tottenham, based on what you know about the lasting effects of trauma on children and the neurobiological aspects of this, does the age of the child at the time of the separation influence how much and how they will be affected?
It's a really good question. Age certainly matters. We know that timing matters as well. But I think the answer to the question is that age matters because the systems that are being affected are going to change as a function of age. So an infant has a certain set of needs that when under stress, a parent is able to help manage. A 12-year-old still has needs and for their parents' input, but they're different at that point because they're at a different developmental stage. So I think no matter whether we're talking about young infants or adolescents, under stress, under toxic stress, they all need their family around them for different reasons, and that's related to differences in what brain regions are undergoing active development at that time. And that can be hard to appreciate when we see an older child who may not be crying for their parent in the same way as a young infant would. That doesn't mean that they don't still have those needs. It's just that the expression is very different.
Yeah, I want to emphasize what you just said, Neem. We know that there are a lot of systems that are being established, not in the first 6 years or 7 years of life. And so what we've known, for example, if you look at research that talks about the impact of poverty on kids, we know that it not only affects them differently due to the stage, but also some of these early experiences have incredible impact afterwards, that you see more, I don't want to say more, but even more intense, more trauma when it's early on. It has an amazing impact on forming some very, very basic, systems as attachment or, security in the world, on your relationships, or cognitive experiences of coping, etc. So I agree with you, Nim, that it changes over time, but I also think that early on, the devastation, it's a lot stronger. The long term. I think that a separation at the age of 12 and a separation at the age of 2, it has different impact, but it's also the sort of long-term consequences are different, might be different.
And then the duration matters as well. So, we know from many different populations that have been studied that the longer this period of separation is, the higher the risk for psychopathology as well as biological changes. The harder question to answer is, well, what is an okay amount? And, several reporters have asked me that question. And I said, well, obviously, we can't answer that question empirically, but it's like asking, it is asking how much trauma is okay to have, right? If it's just 1 week. And I think every parent, would immediately appreciate that is, not a question that we would even begin to answer.
No, and we've already made the point several times that this trauma is likely to have a history of other traumas. So that it's not just a week out of the blue. It can back into lots of other incidents. I'm fascinated by the idea of the sort of child not really being a separate individual, but just being absolutely embedded in that sort of family unit, and that sort of tearing the fabric of that is like tearing the child apart. It's not, it's just not an individual, as you say, it's not an individual who's taken away. It's something which has been disrupted fundamentally.
I mean, this goes back to, Winnicott, the analyst, who said there's no such thing as an infant, right? And it's that very idea which you have to appreciate, given how long as a species we stay in this immature state. Yes. It's by design, because we have an expectation that there will be this other partner that's going to help regulate so many aspects of our lives.
Yeah, and that's why, separation is one of the cruelest things that you can inflict on a developing child.
And remember that culturally we have extended the dependence, right? That, 100 years ago, by 14 or 15, you were expected to a certain extent maybe to be an adult. And we have culturally also moved that dependency way over. Right now we're talking about even 20 to 30s, that people are still depending very much on their parents for many different things.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move on. Now, many of the questions posted by our attendees have focused on what kind of interventions can help children and families to recover from these experiences. Are there therapeutic strategies that are particularly useful in such cases, and also educationally for children, for these children who end up in public schools, what sort of special steps should educators take? So, Dr. Stein, I'll give you this one. Could we hear your perspective?
Sure. So, yeah. So I think there are interventions that we know have some empirical basis that could help in this this type of situation. I want to just tell listeners that the National Child and Traumatic Stress Network has a great website and is a great resource that has a lot of sort of things that people can access quickly and has downloadable manuals and things like that. So one of the things that I think is really important that we've talked about, which is used in sort of psychological first aid and those types of perspectives, is that when you come in and these families are just reunited, these kids are just having lived through this, is really doing a good job of giving that family, understanding what risk factors that family might have, what additional traumas they might have experienced, what perhaps they've already had sort of some difficulty in their relationship, the parent might have some other mental health history. So really doing some really good intervention and triaging at that point to see who might need some additional support around those times. And in particular, when kids experience a trauma, one of the things that we know is the most impactful to them is the disruption in their routines and their family life and their schooling and all those kinds of things that come along with experiencing trauma. The sequelae of trauma are just as disruptive to kids as are the experience of trauma. And a lot of this comes from sort of national disaster kinds of natural disasters kinds of trauma. But what we know is that establishing routines with families, establishing that connection again, letting families have different reactions and understanding and accept that. And then looking at what kind of cognitions could be risky in those, right? Excessive guilt and blame, excessive sort of responsibility, those would be really important to assess at the time. So we know that there's a few interventions that are helpful. Attachment-based interventions have been found to be helpful for kids in foster care that have had sort of these separations and come back, and have been shown to actually have improvement in the HPA dysregulation. So some of the work by Mary García, I can't pronounce her last name, attachment-based kind of work is useful. There's also attachment-based work with adolescents that has been found to be effective, and in particular, down the group in Miami, Cynthia Esteban has a culturally informed and flexible family-based treatment for adolescents that was developed particularly for drug and substance-using adolescents. But their intervention actually has immigrant separation, family separations as something that they address in their intervention. So that might be a good one for folks to look at. Trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy has some research support with refugee populations as well as immigrant populations, and that also is available online that people can access that training and be able to sort of learn a little bit about that. And what's good about that training is more focused on the child, giving them skills to cope in the moment, relaxation skills, distraction skills. So a lot of the psychological first aid would focus on what are you doing in the moment to help you sort of just survive and continue every day sort of getting better. There is actually a very nice intervention that was written by someone's dissertation project, Getting us ID. Lauren Utter has a book on healing and resilience for Latino families, especially with risk for deportation. And that's based on evidence and has some really nice activities that people can do. And that's also, if you Google her, you can access that manual. And finally, you asked about educators, and I think that's really important. One thing that we know from the literature of immigrant kids and refugee kids is that school is a place of refuge. School is a place where that school connection, that connection they make with their peers, that connection that could be a place that can bolster their connection and experiences and can bolster sort of some positive psychological and educational adaptation. And sometimes people feel like they need to come and talk to the kids about their trauma, but in fact, just letting them have those natural connections at school, those natural connections with their peers. And some of the clinical work I've done, I remember a little girl saying, I just want to be on the soccer team. Can you help me get on the soccer team? This was a girl who had come as an unaccompanied minor. Like those are the kinds of things that we would sort of how to help her. How did we get this girl on a soccer team? And that was what she really needed, right? So I think schools can serve a really great place to ameliorate and mitigate some of these stressors through that sense of connection, through that sense of especially validation, right? the validation of you belong here and we're going to take care of you. I also want to point out that there's some good work done in California, in LA, the Mental Health for Immigrants program, which uses a cultural-based sort of trauma-informed intervention, but also helping train teachers on what to expect in terms of trauma responses, how kids are going through trauma, and then some access and support for parents as well. So those are generally some of the interventions that are out there that can really, that have some efficacy with these types of populations.
Yeah, so there was a common theme through that of sort of like rebuilding relationships and connections that are reliable and safe.
That's exactly right.
Compensate for the
That's
disruption.
exactly right.
Yeah, so another question which has been bubbling up in the public conversation about this topic, which has been considerable, is how the experiences of the border detainees might compare to other cases of child separation, such as parents being incarcerated, deployment for military service, family separation, bereavement. So Dr. García Coll, what are your thoughts on how similar or different are this particular separation from these other wider, more common types of separation?
Yeah, I think that what they have in common is the sort of unpredictability to a certain extent. You know, something happens, all of a sudden the parent is gone. It's gone to service, it's gone to jail. I mean, sometimes in divorce, when they're very contentious divorces, and you see that kids don't have access to parents again. So those are very similar, and they are, again, depending on the age of the kid, really devastating in terms of not only missing that particular relationship, but also, as we talked about, changing the dynamics of the family altogether, changing what Gabby was talking about, daily routines, predictability, things that you gave for granted that are not going to be there. So they disrupt not only the relationship and the feeling of not having that secure base, whatever that is, but also other aspects of the child's life. So that's why I think they're very good models, because to a certain extent, we haven't really studied this particular population. We're using sort of the research on other similar populations to argue that these are very similar situations. And I think the lack of not knowing when they're going to get back together. I think kids live routines very nicely. You see kids, repeating the same thing every night, reading the same book sometimes, or going through, rituals that we all do at different times of the day. It might be dinners. It might be talking it at night. I mean, it might be all sorts of other things that really maintain a regularity in life. And when these very important parental figures are gone, the whole system, the whole family system is gone. And we are basically introducing a source of daily stress. And we're really adding to whatever else is going on in their lives. And that can be, from poverty to uncertainty about the world to everything else.
Can I ask all of you, we've been talking very much about the negative impacts. Can you say something about the hope for these children? What's the best thing that you could envisage? I mean, so name something good that could happen to these children that would allow them to recover and have a meaning, have a fulfilled life. Something on the positive side. I didn't prepare you for this question, but it's just popping up as we were discussing this. They're not all basket cases, are they? They're not all hopeless cases. So what can bring them?
I think I will say that, and this again from some of my clinical work in refugee populations, that it is amazing how resilient that folks are, and the sort of that history that they had coming in. I think that's why it's really important to really understand what what were their experiences before, because some folks will be better set up to deal and navigate with this stress. Some children will be better set up for that. Some families will be better set up for that. And that piece of hope, but I think all of them are moving towards something, right? They're moving towards, they're all coming, and they have made it to this sort of this particular point. So to arm the resources to get to that point, you already have to have some more resources than folks that didn't come, right? So we know from the work on sort of the immigrant paradox that immigrants bring with them a lot of hope, a lot of resilience in many ways, because they're the ones that are able to navigate that transition and to get to that point. So so I agree with you that this isn't all. I think it's important that we offer evidence-based sort of treatment to them and humanitarian sort of thoughtful, careful sort of interactions with them, but that you're right that it's not that they don't have any resilience to build off of, and identifying that resilience is really important.
Dr. Tottenham, what about the prospects for rebuilding brain circuits, and how does that work?
Yeah, so I just to echo Gabby's point, I mean, what we've seen in populations exposed to significant traumas is exactly what you're describing, which is a lot of individual differences, and that's not insignificant because a lot of that is reflecting resilience. That doesn't negate the fact that the average, that the risk is significantly increased, and that's what we really want to work against. But the resilience piece is really important for several reasons. One of them is that I feel like I'm going more negative again, but sometimes resilience comes with a cost as well. And so I think that even for the child or the families that are doing well, we don't want to ignore them either, because there could be some other areas of concern that we want to pay attention to and still continue to provide support for those individuals.
Duncan, I want to add something to this, because I've been working with immigrants.
Could you add one thing, which is, can you just say also, add to that, why are some children more resilient than others?
Are you asking Cynthia that?
Yeah, I'll ask Cynthia that. If you could add that to your...
Well, there's so many reasons. I mean, Gabby already described a lot of the environmental reasons, that there are family dynamics, there are individual temperamental qualities, there are genetic differences that we can consider. There are, one's own developmental history differences. So it's really a confluence of factors that are coming together. But I think that one of the promising things about brain development is that the human brain takes a very long time to develop. And so what that means is that we have extended brain plasticity. And so I think that that gives us a lot of hope for thinking about the positive effects, the large positive effects of interventions. Obviously, the earlier they can happen, the better, the higher quality, the more targeted they are to the individual, the better. But there are many examples in the literature of individuals who are able to benefit from positive experiences due to this increased brain plasticity throughout adolescence.
Yeah. Dr. García Coll,
I would like to add,
yes.
I'm exploding here. Anyway, since year 2000, I've been working, trying to understand why some families and some groups do better than others with incredible history of trauma. And what I have found, and also you learn it from the literature on resilience, is that usually one good relationship in your life really makes a tremendous difference, right? And for most of us, that's one parent. But many of us who don't have parents or anything like that, it can be a teacher, it can be a coach, it can be a peer. I mean, we are, I think, looking evolutionarily, that we are developing tools to learn from the environment and to take on the good stuff from the environment. So what we found on the immigrant paradox is that, there are things in schools, there are things in culture, there are things in family relationships that really help you cope and actually excel in spite of this tremendous history of trauma. So if good conditions are allowed, right? If good housing, if good schooling, if good mental health programs, all of that can really guarantee to a certain extent that families, kids, communities are going to excel sometimes. And that is remarkable. I mean, we do have a tremendous amount and drive to do right and to really learn and benefit from good relationships and context. But those relationships and context have to be there for us. Yes. If we leave these families with nothing, then we are really just re-traumatizing, re-victimizing people who are coming here with the most amazing energy to do well and to succeed.
Yeah, so it's
those are lessons that I've learned from working with so many families in this context.
It's the relationship again, isn't it? It's throughout this is the relationship, and that is the one thing that's under attack in this situation, and it's the fundamental of everything. Okay, so let's move on to the third part, the final part of our discussion, and I want to open this question up to all of you, and really ask you two questions. One, the first is, this has caused an enormous amount of debate, and it has affected emotionally people all over the United States and around the world. And so what would you each say to the question, what can we, normal citizens, do in this situation? It might not be a therapeutic thing, it might be a political thing, but just basically, what do you say to that? And the second question is, what should public bodies do in the United States? So those are two questions. And if I could just put both of them to each of you and see what happens, really. And I'll start randomly with Dr. Stein. And if you could lead, and then I'll ask each of you those questions.
Yeah, I think we all sort of feel very helpless when you see this right on the news, and you see sort of these situations, and like we all want to do things. So I think there are a lot of things we can do. One is you can really volunteer in your local community to work with immigrant populations there, because these families may have experienced similar trauma, similar kinds of separation, similar kinds of things to do. So you could really just impact within your own community by your time, with money, local causes. A lot of the work that has been done on this, sort of the kids that are being impacted by immigration policies more broadly in terms of raids, immigration raids and detention and deportation, is widespread. And so these are causing widespread parent-child separations, not just at the border right now, but all over the United States. So I think that those are the places where people can provide some resources. And what it seemed like a lot of local charities, churches, local organizations were very much involved in providing that social support if your parent was deported, or if your parent was separated from you, how you could maintain that routine that you need. So those are ways in which just looking within your local community, besides sending money to the places that are organizing and getting money for the legal kind of support that these families need, and the emotional and psychological support they need on the border, which is really critical as well. And so I think that's one of those things where I think thinking about this issue specific for these particular families, but to recognize this is something that's happening across the country.
World.
Dr. García Coll.
Oh dear. I think more of public policies. The latest research that we have is that the more positive public policies are toward immigrant refugee populations, that these populations end up contributing to the tax base. They contribute to a population growth that sometimes is even negative. And I'm talking about both Europe and the US. And to really think that immigrants come in with an amazing energy. So any support that we as independent employers or workers, or anything that we can do to help them incorporate in a positive way to our communities, the better it is for us, for them, and for the country. this negative view that we have of refugees and immigrants right now really is incredibly detrimental to children and their families. To be exposed to negative, to name calling, to racism and everything else. And, you know, if we don't want them here, then at least let's work on doing family reunification someplace else, right? That at least we are trying to say, we know that the family is the unit. We need to get these kids and parents together. And if we don't want them in our country, then at least work with other governments to make them, you know, to make them be a family unit again. And I think that as individuals, we need to keep on the pressure. We need to keep on talking about this. We need to keep on saying what we believe in, and we need to be thinking about what are the public policies of our country and how should we be voting the next time that we have a chance.
Yeah.
But I can't think of it as something that is not political. And sometimes science has to be used for public policy and for policy and for practice.
Yeah. Dr. Tottenham.
So, yeah, I think, you know, I mean, these are tough political times. There's great division in this country. And I think that immigration policy is controversial. It's political, right? But the things that we're talking about in this panel are not political. They're not controversial. I think everyone agrees that we want to invest in child development. And so that makes it very easy, right? It's the reason why so many people are enraged by what happened with this policy. And so I think, just to piggyback on what Gabby was saying, is in many ways keep it local. So definitely contact your local elected politicians. There are marches around the country this weekend on June 30th. So organizations like Families Belong Together and New York Immigration Coalition are organizing marches. People can donate. There are, if you go to Families Belong Together, they have a list of groups that can take donations. So I think in many ways, as devastating as this policy has been to us, there are many things that we can do even locally to make a difference.
And can I just add one more thing? So I think the national policies also impacts these populations living in this country. So we know that from research, and we said in the evidence brief that the immigrant policies affect citizen Latinos as well, and citizen or naturalized citizens, in that the negative tenor, we know that increases some of the risk for their own worry and concerns and symptomatology. So another thing that people can do is really sort of backing what Cynthia was saying, is making sure we're changing the language that we use to describe and talk about this population, and also reaching out and supporting the community around you that may live there, that may not be the specific people that are impacted by the separations, but are being impacted by sort of this larger national discourse on what these separations sort of mean to them as immigrant populations. We know that, for example, citizen Latinos in times of where these types of policies are put are less likely to access healthcare, are less likely to access support. So we need as communities to reach out to these populations and say, this is safe, this is a way you can access health care, this is a way you can access support for your family, for whatever it is that you might need. And these are citizen Latinos. So I think it's important to recognize that this is large-scale ramifications for the whole country as well.
We've had a question in. How should people talk? How should people in the USA talk to their own children? How do you explain this to young children in your own families who are undoubtedly picking all of this up? Cynthia.
How do we speak to all the children in the US? Anybody?
How do we speak to our own children and explain this?
To our own children, right. I mean, I think the historical context is important, and talk about how there's been other periods in history where there is this sort of view that by separating parents from children, we are deterring populations to be part of our own country, and it has happened, and that we have regretted most of the times that we've done this, and that this is sometimes that we don't learn from our own history. And governments and populations get blinded by their own fears of the other, and that this is a way we have to be inclusive. That talked about humanity. What is it like to be humane to others? Why our governments are not acting this way? What are the fears that people are perceiving nationwide and worldwide? And how, you know, we as a family, we don't agree or agree. I mean, some people do agree, but we don't agree in this level because we have the evidence to tell us that this is very detrimental, short-term and long-term. And that we hope that our governments at some point will learn from these experiences. So in the future, we don't have to do this to any other group, any other population, any other country, etc. That This is a teaching moment. It is a teaching moment with our kids. It is a teaching moment for our communities. It is a teaching moment for everybody to really think about why these things keep on happening. What is the underlying fears and anxieties that the other brings to us, and how do we have to talk about our common humanity and our understanding of why these families come to our borders.
So I've written down 3 things: march this weekend, donate, and talk to your children about it, actually, because this is a historic moment, and actually open the discussion with them. We've had a question just referring back to the earlier discussion about stress. And the question is, what is the difference between toxic stress and not toxic stress? Nim, would you like to take that one in terms of what's the difference?
Yeah, it's a really important question. So we all experience stress throughout the day. I mean, it's you know, hard to escape it, but there are different types of stress. There are stressors that are actually good for us, right? So when we experience challenge and we actually win, we're a little bit stressed. When we're getting married, we're definitely stressed, but hopefully that's a good thing. And you know, some people call that eustress, as in it's positive for us. Then there's a stress that doesn't feel so good, but it's somehow manageable. So the types of stressors that on average everyone is likely to experience at some point. What prevents that from becoming toxic stress often is that in that moderate range stress, you have some means of coping, and that some means usually means a supportive other. That can be a romantic partner, a friend. In the case of a child, it's usually their parent. And so by removing the parent under this stressful time, what you're doing is you're now shifting that stress into toxic stress. And it's that toxic stress zone that we are most concerned about, because that's what leads to the enduring changes in neurobiology, stress physiology, and behavioral outcomes.
Yeah, so it's again, it's you mentioned the role of a relationship in managing stress and stopping it being toxic. So again and again through this whole discussion, we've had this recurring theme of relationship is the foundation, and that is the foundation that is being attacked in this situation, and it's a fundamental assault in a way on the child and on the family. Well, look, thank you very much, all 3 of you, for this. It's been absolutely fascinating. I've enjoyed myself enormously sitting here in the UK. We're enjoying the hottest weather the hottest June in history, apparently. So I'm going to hand over now back to Laura at SRCD. Laura, are you there?
I'm here.
A miracle of technology, you're here. So thank you very much, Laura. I'm going to hand back to you.
Thank you so much, Duncan. Again, this is Laura Namey. I'm the Executive Director here at SRCD, and I want to offer my deepest appreciation to our panelists and our moderator today for such an engaging and thoughtful discussion on such a critical and obviously very sobering issue. And I also want to really extend my appreciation to all of you who are attending today's webinar. We hope you found it informative and provided some useful ways to think about this issue. Those of you who have registered, we will be sending out to you. A number of people have asked for some of the references that our panelists have mentioned, so we will collate some things, some resources to send out to you. We invite you to continue this conversation with us on our social media channels. This is something that we all feel very passionately about and all really want to help provide the tools that science can give to really help people figure out how to think about and how to act upon these uncomfortable and painful situations that are arising. As I mentioned at the start of the session, a recording of this session will be posted on our SRCD YouTube channel very soon. Thank you all so very much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.